All right. Hi. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone wherever you are. First of all, my brief introduction. I'm Colin Koh. I'm going to be the moderator for today's RSIS webinar on US-China rivalry, decoupling world. Now, some basic housekeeping rules, just to emphasize what you saw on the holding slide, is please do enter your questions and your comments into the Q&A function. I think this is something I need to emphasize, even though I believe many of you will have been quite well schooled in video conferencing tools over the past 1 year. So you can start doing that while the presentations are running. So end of the entire set of presentations, what I will do is to consolidate the questions, comments, and pass it out to our panelists, right? So allow me to give a brief overview of what's about. The United States program of RSIS has been looking at, and of course, following the developments over the past 1 year or so, when it comes to the transition between the Trump administration earlier and the current Biden administration, and to look at how US policies, especially in particular reference to the Sino-US relations, would have an implication on regional dynamics. Now, and it's quite a timely webinar today because just not long ago, the White House released what is so-called the interim national security strategic guidance. Is a 20-something page document. You can actually go through it pretty quickly, but I had a good look at it. It's very interesting. These likely serves as a sort of broad sweep of the key directions as the policies are being currently implemented, just less than 2 months of the Biden administration being in office. Now, a few key things that I thought is interesting to highlight here before we go into the is the first thing that struck me was that the Indo-Pacific was first mentioned. That was on page 10 actually, and followed on by Europe and then the Western Hemisphere. So this seems to indicate the prevailing focus of the Biden administration on the Indo-Pacific. And of course, relevant to our discussion today is China has been warranted repeated mention and emphasis in this document. And there was one quote that was, of course, very interesting, and yet at the same time, not too unpredictable. I will quote it. It is the only competitor potentially capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system. I end quote. Now, so this point is something that is not too new because just not long ago, soon before and after the Biden administration came to office, there has been repeated mention about China, and of course, the current bipartisan consensus on China being a long-term national security challenge could not go unnoticed. And what is another very interesting point in this strategic guidance has been the emphasis on allies and partners, which I will presume to constitute what is so-called the position of strength that the Biden administration has been talking about in terms of engaging in an effective competition in the long run with China. So that is, a slightly different tone from the previous administration that has largely been couched in terms of the America First policy. And so with that, I thought it was interesting, the existing or pre-existing policies that the Trump administration had left behind. Many of them are, at least for the time being, kept in place by the Biden administration. Things like the curbs on technology, the issue of 5G, for example, and the tariffs. Those are kept for the time being. So it will be interesting to see, once the national security strategy is unveiled by the Biden administration, not long after this, it'll be good to see how it goes. And of course, it raises a specter of the discussion we had very earlier on during the Trump administration, was the potential of a decoupling between China and the US. And these will have grave implications for regional countries in the Indo-Pacific, not least small countries like Singapore. So today, we managed to bring together a very great panel of speakers, and they have very diverse professional expertise that could share with us, and allow me to sort of introduce them one by one in terms of the sequence of the presentation. So I have here, first of all, Professor Liang Yan, who is a professor of economics at the Willamette University and a research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Professor Liang's research interest includes the Chinese economy, international trade and finance, economic development, and modern money theory. So Professor Liang has published articles in various prestigious journals, as well as contributed in various book projects, and she has received numerous research grants from various foundations and contributed very frequently to the media. And of course, prior to joining Willamette, Professor Liang taught at the University of Redlands and Bard College at Simon's Rock, and she served as an editorial board member of the Journal of Economic Issues and is an editorial board member of the journal Chinese Economy. And finally, Professor Liang is the vice president of the Association for Institutional Thought and also an active member of the Association of Evolutionary Economics. And the next speaker that we have here is Ms. Naomi Wilson, who serves as the vice president of policy Asia at the Information Technology Industry Council. Prior to joining ITI, Naomi served at the US Department of Homeland Security, where she most recently held the position of acting director for Asia Pacific. And in that capacity, she played a leading role on cybersecurity, law enforcement, and customs cooperation issues related to Asia, and served as a senior advisor to then Secretary Jay Johnson. During her tenure at DHS, Naomi led development and implementation of priority policy initiatives for DHS engagement with China, including secretarial engagements and agreements. And she worked closely with interagency colleagues to negotiate and implement agreements stemming from the September 2015 state visit between then President Barack Obama and the current Chinese leader Xi Jinping, including managing the US-China high-level dialogue on cybercrime and related issues for the department. And so prior to joining the department, Naomi also served as a staffer on the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs as a research assistant at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She holds a bachelor's degree in English and a master's in International Affairs and National Security. In 2011, she completed intensive Chinese language training at Peking University, so she could speak advanced Mandarin and French, and she's a native of Connecticut. And finally, last but not least, we have here Assistant Professor Huang at the Yale NUS College in Singapore. He specializes in international politics with a focus on China's foreign policy and Southeast Asian politics and US-China relations. He's a recipient of the Lee Kong Chian National University of Singapore Stanford University Distinguished Fellow on Contemporary Southeast Asia, that is in the period of 2018-2019, and the American Political Science Association's Foreign Policy Section Best Paper Award in 2014. He's the author or co-author of 3 books and has published various research articles in prestigious journals and also through commercial and university presses. And he has testified on China's foreign affairs before the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission and US Congress. And he has served as a consultant for US and European foundations, governments, and companies on their strategies and policies in Asia. So until 2009, he was a researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, And prior to that, he worked with the Freeman Chair China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. So he's Doctor of Philosophy and Bachelor of Science are respectively from the University of Southern California and Georgetown University. So with this introduction, so allow me to segue into the discussion. So I will give the floor now to Professor Liang. So Professor Liang, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kong, for the very sweet and kind introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to the RSIS panel with the other two distinguished panelists. I feel really honored and privileged to have the opportunity to share my thoughts on US-China relations. So I do have a small slides that I want to share with the audience. So I'm going to share the screen. Okay. So I know the organizers would like to hold the questions at the end of the presentation after all panelists have spoken. But if there's any sort of pressing question or clarifying question, feel free to send it my way. So I just recently wrote a few pieces on this issue about US-China relations. And interestingly, I did use the words like decoupling or competitive recoupling. So some of my short essays were right here. They appeared in the Diplomat and East Asia Forum and the Japan Times. But my main argument here is that, under the previous administration, under Trump presidency, we did see decoupling, which occurred in an arbitrary, discrete, and very disruptive manner for both countries and the rest of the world. We have witnessed tariff war, blacklisting Chinese tech companies, delisting Chinese companies from New York Stock Exchange. We have seen visa restrictions, cutting off cultural and intellectual exchanges. We have seen closing consulates, and we have seen, the very pernicious talks from the White House through Twitter, calling this pandemic China virus, Kung flu, or Wuhan virus. So all these, I think, have done really sort of damages to the two countries' relationship. It pretty much poisoned the two countries' connections. And as Biden came in office, we started to see his China strategy gradually taking shape. And it seems that there is some continuity. A lot of the scholars and observers have pointed out, it seems that Biden's strategy does not change the substance. He still sees China as the major competitor, the rivalry, even though, he's sort of strategy is going to be probably less mean-spirited and will be also more premeditated than Trump's. We have seen his cabinet picks. So, from trade representatives to national security advisors to Secretary of State to, Secretary of Treasury. I think it does exhibit this sort of pattern of hawkishness towards China. And Biden himself has made remarks, for example, calling Xi Jinping a leader without that democratic bone. And he also has signed executive orders recently to emphasize Buy American strategy, and also ordered to examine supply chain of the four main technologies, the high capacity battery, and a few others, rare earths, and other two industries. And all these seem to suggest that there is a direction or posture towards decoupling. So what is driving this trend? I think there are two main reasons. One is, China's rise has presented some sort of challenges to US national security and its economic and technological supremacy. And so I think that's one of the reasons why Biden is seeing China as the main competitor. And then the second reason, of course, has to do with that political and public sentiment. There is a tremendous bipartisan support to take a hardline approach towards China. So I think that kind of political pressure is difficult to resist. Especially Biden is, of course, looking forward to the re-election 4 years from now. So nonetheless, I think there are also countervailing, forces. As Anthony Blinken has put it, the relationship is a complicated one. It's not just a competitive or adversarial, but there's also competitive elements. Biden's team pledges to make the U.S. foreign policy work better for middle class, putting this sort of blue collar on this foreign policy. And so in a recent interview that I had with the China Global TV network, I talked about how Biden's policy is couched on the domestic priorities. And the 4 priorities for him include putting the pandemic under control, revitalizing the economy, combating climate change, and addressing social and racial injustice. And it's clear that on all these fronts, working with China would be desirable. It's a global pandemic and requires global actions in medical research and dissemination of vaccines and development of vaccines and production of vaccines and dissemination of vaccines. So it calls on collective and coordinated efforts. Revitalizing the economy, we still remember back in 2008 when global financial crisis hit, China and the US had coordinated policies in launching economic rescue packages. The playbook is still on the shelf. It's the matter of whether they're going to deploy it this time around. Combating climate change, it goes without saying, both countries, the largest emitters, it does take both to work together to slow down climate change. And finally, addressing social injustice with the very hostile and demonization of Trump's towards China and Asian Americans. We have seen the rising hate crimes towards Asians and Asian Americans in the United States, and that actually prompted Biden to prohibit the calling the virus as China virus. So I think, again, on all these fronts, there is fertile ground for both countries to coordinate and collaborate. Finally, Biden also vouches to reinvest U.S. Infrastructure and technologies and its workers to compete with China from a position of strength. And I think that is great for America, but it's also for both countries, because I think if the US is able to strengthen from within, it will take a less hostile attitude and posture towards China. Not to mention, it will help to pacify, the resentment of the middle class Americans towards globalization. There is a recent book titled, the trade war is in fact a class war, and I think that speaks very nicely to that tension within the United States. So a reinvestment within the United States will be productive and helpful for its international relations. So again, I just want to quickly go through some of these recoupling channels. I think, the trade war, although, Biden has not scratched it away right away, he wanted to wait for a more comprehensive, review of these trade deals and the tariffs. But I think it's very clear, and Biden himself has acknowledged and criticized the tariff war, right? And we all know that it has cost jobs and has cost the US's GDP. It has cost business profits to sort of wage this trade war, which was considered by Trump as an easy and quick win, which turned out not to be the case. So I think, it's clear, bar from the political pressure, Biden would hopefully soon to, remove the tariffs, or at least work it in a way that it's less destructive and costly for both countries. Especially, when you look at the impacts of trade war, right? It cost Americans, and it didn't really help to reduce the trade imbalances between the US and China, or the US's overall deficits. So I'm not going to go into the sort of numbers. I know sometimes numbers are helpful, but I'll leave you to kind of read it yourself. And then the other part is, the supply chain and foreign investment. So it's very difficult for companies to simply pack up and go, right? And the overwhelming evidence has pointed that over 80% of American businesses do not plan to relocate away from China. And despite all those going, political tensions, American companies are still investing heavily in China, not only because the supply chain issue, but also because the very attractive consumer markets. China has a 300 million strong middle class with this tremendous purchasing power. And I think that market is just too good to let go. And the US investment continued to rise in China. And so I don't think the business themselves are anytime soon willing to pull out from China. And finally, not to mention the financial channel that China started to open its financial market, and many of the financial giants are willing to take an inroad to Chinese markets. And China is more than willing to partner with American investors. They have this leading edge services and quality products that China really needs. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for both countries to recouple. But I do agree that technology is a thorny and complicated issue. And the difficulty, I think, and I can elaborate it later, it's not really for the United States to somehow build alliances with other countries to right the wrongs of China. I think there are many reasons to believe that the whole idea of piracy or theft of intellectual properties are grossly exaggerated if it's not purposefully distorted. And I think just by way of China's natural development and its recent escalated efforts, I think that will be dealt with properly. But the really difficulty is how much the US is willing to accept China as a technological rivalry and how much it is willing to include China in the rulemaking and also compete in a fair and transparent way. And, I would like to talk more about that later, maybe with other panelists as well, and as well as the audience, because I do think this is one of the most challenging issues. So what do we expect going forward? Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan, as we know, Sullivan is now the National Security Advisor. They co-authored an article back in 2019 in which they talked about the best approach then will be to lead with competition, follow with offers of cooperation, and refuse to negotiate any linkages between Chinese existence on global challenges and concessions on US interests. So it's clear that there will be recoupling, there will be cooperation and collaboration, but there will be also competition. And I think there are many grounds that present opportunity for collaboration: pandemic control, economic recovery, climate change, developing country debt, nuclear deproliferation, international peacekeeping, many other issues that are, I think, fruitful for joint efforts. But continued competition on technology, trade, investment, and also values, I think will continue. So it's really the idea of competitive recoupling and hopefully peaceful coexistence. So I will stop right here, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Liang, for this very concise overview, and you sort of help us set the pace of the discussion by striking a somewhat cautious but optimistic tone, because you talked about recoupling, and so I thought that is a very promising area to talk about. That we'll leave it to the subsequent Q&A. So thank you again for sharing your views. So with that, I'll move on to Naomi for to share your views. Yeah, thank you, Naomi. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ko. And I very much appreciated Professor Liang's remarks. I agree with the vast majority of what she said. And Actually, I agree entirely on the substance, but I think my takeaway is perhaps a little bit more on the negative than the positive side. Although I do appreciate the term recoupling, and I hope so too, but I have my doubts, and so I'll kind of talk about that a little bit here. But first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. I very much wish that I could be there in person. I do love Singapore, but hopefully sometime next year we'll get the go ahead to travel once again. But until then, I wanted to talk you through some of my thoughts on decoupling and where we are now and where we're going. So the lesson that I take away from the past 4 or 5 years really is that we've seen that globalization and economic integration are not irreversible. I had my suspicions when people started talking about decoupling and breaking the supply chains, and of course our companies, we represent about 70 major multinational companies that operate across the globe, and they have incredibly complex supply chains. And we spent a lot of time talking with policymakers about how you can't just break supply chains apart and put them back together overnight. It doesn't work that way. They're far too complex. But nevertheless, we've definitely seen a migration towards a preference for decoupling, especially in specific sectors. As Dr. Liang mentioned, the tech sector, which is my sector in particular, has taken the brunt of the focus. So how did we get here? I think it's important to set the stage and to back up a little bit and note that the relationship between the US and China, especially as new technologies have been emerging, has been deteriorating for some time. This did not emerge overnight with the Trump administration, even though they may be able to claim IP rights to the term decoupling. But the US government, from their perspective, going back several years, gave China numerous chances to live up to its commitments, right? Whether it's through the WTO or through bilateral dialogues and engagements. And ultimately, by the end of the Obama administration and the beginning of the Trump administration, I think it's fair to say that the US government was fed up. There had been a shift in China's behavior towards the end of the Obama administration, a positive shift, I might add, on IP theft and behavioral norms in cyberspace. But the narrative had become so entrenched in the US that it really had a life of its own. And to this day, you hear policymakers, particularly on the Hill, continue to echo this same talking point of, China steals this, that, and the other thing, and they're eating our lunch. And that was something that was really easy for then President Trump to grab onto. So all of this created an environment of suspicion and mistrust. And as I said, this coupled with this rising attention on emerging technology and 5G and AI, and what does this mean? And policymakers are just trying to figure out what the implications for these technologies are, how they regulate them or don't regulate them. And they start to see things through a win or lose lens. And so the US really went from trying to combat market access restrictions and open the Chinese market more to decoupling and wanting to leave the market completely. And as Dr. Liang mentioned, that's not the position of the business community. There's far too much at stake with the China market. It's far too important and influential to just up and leave. But nevertheless, we saw a series of policies come out of the Trump administration: tariffs, visa restrictions, export controls, and numerous uncoordinated pieces of legislation that really made decoupling more than just a buzzword and made it more reality. And then, unfortunately, when COVID happened, it only made things worse and really zeroed out any trust that was there at a minimal level. And so now we're in the Trump administration, and we've reached a stage of full-on fear-mongering. The narrative is not nuanced at all. It's very much China bad. Anything having to do with China, any technology, there's suspicion, and the political impetus is to separate yourself from that. And I think it's important to understand in the context of the business community, the Trump administration was a very difficult time in which to operate and to express reasonable dissent and to express economic facts of how the world works and what the business community's needs are. And I think that's still a struggle. I do think that there's still a disconnect between the business community and the US government in terms of understanding that they really both have the same national security, economic interest type of goals in mind. But nevertheless, that's the situation in which we find ourselves. And so in the Trump administration, we started to see this tit for tat type of policies. And again, this wasn't completely new. We had seen indigenous innovation policies and a preference for Chinese products, for example, for some time in Chinese legislation and regulation. But it really, the trade war really upped the ante. And we started to see, as you will all recall, the reciprocal back and forth on the escalating tariffs. But it was more than that. It became how do we use export controls as a tool for decoupling? And it started from a reasonable perspective on the US government side with congressional and legislative reform of export controls in the Export Controls Reform Act. And then it sort of took on a life of its own, where we had numerous executive orders, which are issued by the White House, not by the Congress, and implementing rules coming from those executive orders, largely tasked to the Department of Commerce, and in particular to one unfortunate bureau within the Department of Commerce. So they were tasked with writing these impossible rules for businesses to follow in order to safeguard US technology while not completely undermining business objectives and initiatives. And of course, that's easier said than done. And there's still a lot of questions remaining with respect to the regulations that are either in draft or are final and out, and how companies will ultimately implement them. The other new addition we saw was the shift to decoupling of data. I mean, data has been a big discussion point over the past few years in particular across governments. And now we're starting to see governments talk about data as a commodity, data as the new oil, as something that's in the national interest. And this is interesting because it's a policy development and an attempt to regulate that we've seen mostly in other countries and not in the US. The Europeans have GDPR. In Asia, there's Apex CBPR, and a lot of governments are implementing or at least passing data localization restrictions. But we started to see first in the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US process, the CFIUS process, when that was reformed in 2018, I believe, through legislation, there was a focus on data and not just scrutinizing investments into the US, but also what does data mean in that context? And then, of course, probably the most notorious example of data decoupling and the focus on data came in the form of the TikTok and WeChat executive orders, which are still effectively on hold per the US court system. So I don't expect that those will go anywhere under the new administration anytime soon, but definitely emblematic of the broader trend lines. I think there are also a lot of lessons that we can learn from tariffs. So tariffs was kind of the first step in the decoupling process. And as I mentioned, there was a lot of explaining that business advocates had to do for policymakers to help them understand the opportunity costs, that you can't just up and move the supply chain. It's expensive, it's time consuming. And guess what? If other companies and countries are not forced to do this, then they get a competitive advantage. So, that was a one-sided and very linear perspective that I think a lot of policymakers took in assessing how decoupling would play out and how tariffs would play out, thinking that other countries are aligned with this perspective, and not necessarily thinking from a company competitiveness perspective, that other companies will capitalize on a vacancy in the market. In terms of the cost to trade, I recommend that you look at the Chamber of Commerce's recent report on the consequences of decoupling. It has some really frightening statistics in terms of the amount of GDP that could be sacrificed in the US by 2025, including a dearth of $190 billion annually if we continue to keep 25% tariffs in place on all of our trade, $30 billion annual loss to US services, trade exports, if Chinese students and tourists coming to the US are put on hold. And then there's the intangibles, the ideas, the investments that are sacrificed and lost. And, all of that, it's greater than just competitive advantage. I think companies certainly want to convey the cost benefit analysis to policymakers. And especially when we talk about innovation and future technologies, one of the things that we highlight for policymakers is, look, if you're going to cut off these sales to China, just because it's China, you have to understand that that is money that we no longer have as a company to put into research and development to develop the next emerging technology. And, coupled with the fact that the exchanges between students and scientists and regular business people has been diminished, if not deterred. I think it really has a compounding effect in terms of not just the US ability to innovate and to create future technologies, but globally. We really need that type of cross-cutting partnership and discussion in order to foster what these next generation technologies are going to look like and who they'll serve. And to think that we can do it in a vacuum is, really pretty short-sighted, to put it mildly. So shifting a little bit to what happens with the new administration, I think we've seen a very similar mindset from the Biden-Harris administration in terms of recognition that China hasn't lived up to its commitments, needs to be held accountable, something needs to change, but the strategy is still very much to be laid out. I expect that, and there already have been signals that on issues like supply chain, for example, the line will still be to be hard on China. And part of it is political and optics driven, but I think part of it is also national security driven. And that's not necessarily wrong to say that there are certain elements of a supply chain that, if they're choke points, they need to be reassessed in the context of national security. It's not necessarily to say that it's a threat from a nation state, but you have to think in the context of natural disasters, or as we've seen with COVID and the US lack of PPE. There are things in the supply chain that do need to be, if not localized, at least more readily accessible, or you need to have a backup plan in case the current supply chain encounters problems. But it started to get increasingly messy in terms of talking about supply chain security when we talk about national security. And this is where the US has started to mirror China, probably going back about 10 years, this intersection of national security and economic security that for so long we had asked the Chinese government to disentangle. And now, we find ourselves in a position where the previous US administration has tied those two together. And we're seeing that play out in the context of decoupling, in the context of US-China tech competition, and the trade war. And I don't anticipate that going away anytime soon. The other issue I wanted to briefly touch on is, getting other countries on board. And this is something that, as was stated before, we've heard a lot about from the new US administration, this desire to embrace multilateralism and to work with our allies and like-minded partners in order to address some of the difficulties with respect to China's behavior. And I don't think the US administration has any is under the impression that this will be easy, but I'm not sure that they understand exactly how hard it will be to get consensus across allies, across various governments, especially in a post-pandemic economic recovery environment. Governments are going to be focused on, and including the US, getting their domestic economies back up and running, getting their people vaccinated and healthy. And, the notion of isolating China from certain parts of the supply chain is going to be really difficult. And not necessarily impossible in certain respects. There could be an argument for some areas within export controls, but export controls in particular and supply chain adjustments tend to only really be effective if they're multilateral in nature. And at this point in time, I'm not sure that it's a convincing sell for other nations to partner on a decoupling effort like that. So I will stop there and hope to be able to engage with you all more in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Naomi, for sharing your views. I thought two particular points stand out to me. One is your highlighting about the perils of decoupling, because I mean, we know that the US has been a successful great power to this day because of its ability to harvest diverse talents from all over the world, and effectively cutting off some of those economic, technological, and even professional linkages with China could potentially be counterproductive of its own. So I think there is a need to sort of strike the balance. And of course, you mentioned about the issue of highlighting some of those choke points. And I thought that was very interesting, since it was not too long ago mentioned in the press about identifying those choke points, especially that concerns the supply chain. And if not because of China, then it is important to consider those choke points in the context of broader set of contingencies beyond China, in the context of pandemic and say natural disaster that you mentioned. So I thought this is something that is worth looking at, and somehow I think it presents a certain policy conundrum on how do you strike the balance and how do you manage perception in that sense. Because when you try to create those choke points due to a broad set of reasons, it could be misconstrued as potentially trying to drive towards the decoupling direction. So I thought this is very interesting, and I thought we should have a further discussion on that later. So thank you again, Naomi, for this. Allow me to move on to Professor Huang. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Colin, and thanks to the RSIS team, Anthony and Amanda, for organizing this panel. And thanks to the 93 attendees who are still with us 48 minutes into the conversation. The good thing about going last, I guess, is that I can say wholeheartedly that I agree with Professor Liang and Ms. Wilson's points. I think these are all very, very nuanced views, and nobody's taking any sort of partisan lines. I think they're rather objective, and on the whole, I think pretty sensible assessments of what's going on with regard to decoupling and US-China relations. Just to sort of pick up where Naomi started in the beginning, I would probably even draw it further back beyond the sort of the Obama administration. I think where this whole prospects for this discussion for decoupling came into place, really it's you could even dial the timeline back to the early 2000s. In 2000s or in late 2000, when the Clinton administration decided and pushed hard, convincing Congress to pass the permanent normal trading relations with China. Subsequently, the Chinese joining the WTO in 2001. So it's been two decades, right? So 20 years has passed. And I think this is sort of where people are now beginning to take stock and reviewing sort of what has happened, what were the promises that were made in the beginning. If you look back to the argument that the Clinton administration was pushing for, passing PNTR with China, having a normalized trading relationship with China, bringing China into the international economic order, the WTO, etc. This is going to bring a tremendous amount of economic benefits for American consumers, American businesses, also a positive development for US strategic interests, and good for China, right? As there is an increasing sense of liberalization that may take place gradually over time in fundamentally a capitalist economy under a communist regime. So 2 decades later, I think we're beginning to see that people are a little bit disillusioned and perhaps a little bit impatient with sort of reaping the fruits and the benefits of pushing China into the international economic order. The argument is that trade and technology is supposed to lead to a greater convergence between China and the West or the rest. And the argument by proponents for economic nationalism in the United States and elsewhere is that they haven't. So come about this sort of decoupling discussion and dialogue. The good thing about being a scholar and not in the policy realm is that we can pontificate in an armchair and look back and take stock of these things in the broader trend lines. I think it's a little bit unfair and too simplistic to say that this sort of pathway toward integration with China into the global economy hasn't really paid off. It's not that China doesn't want or is being an outlier in supporting the international order, right? It's more likely that there is compliance in issue-based order, and there's a series, and it's more varied. It's not that China has become a responsible stakeholder across the board. But on certain sectorial areas over the last 2 decades, I think, generally speaking, most sensible people and experts and scholars would agree that they are generally supportive of free-ish trade, the Chinese. They're working through the WTO and trade dispute mechanisms and settlements. Lowering of trade barriers across the board, they are going down and declining. Not in all areas, there's still concerns, but a recent OECD report finds that China on the whole has been living up to some of the commitments that it's made and promised when it joined the WTO. But there are definitely sticking points, and chief among which are intellectual property protection. That remains a key area of concern. Technology theft, as Naomi talked about. There are very opaque regulatory policies that the Chinese government imposes. And of course, there are large and hefty amounts of subsidies for state-owned enterprises that creates an uneven level playing field for companies trying to get into the Chinese market. So these are certain sticking points that have yet to be accomplished and still remains a work in progress for China. So I think if we look at sort of where the U.S. standing is in the region as it moves forward with a new administration, I'm actually a little bit cautiously optimistic as well, because of the vantage point of sitting here in Singapore and looking at what this actually means for small states and small state strategies, particularly in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia and East Asia, Northeast Asia. The U.S. administration is conducting this review of supply chains of semiconductors and IT tech sectors, and that's a positive development. I think the two speakers have mentioned that there's some silver lining behind this, right? It means that taking stock and reviewing how to better manage risks, how to reduce vulnerabilities, address those choke points, and most importantly, propose new methods and sources of research and development. The U.S. has always been a hub, a powerhouse for technology, technological innovation. It is leading the pathway in terms of artificial intelligence. Forget 5G, we're now looking at 6G, right? This is an open field in which the United States has the human capital, not just the technology, to lead the way. And I think if what we've seen in the last month or two since Biden's administration kicked into full gear is that some of it is browbeating, some of it is a carryover from the past administration, the tariffs being one vis-a-vis China. But we also are beginning to see some signs and indication of pragmatism in this administration. The clearest indicator is, how prominent are you going to push human rights in your foreign policy agenda? With the case in Saudi Arabia, we find that there may be times when one cannot afford to alienate strategic partners, friends, or allies. Right? I think what the U.S. administration will quickly see, and it's stocked with China experts who are pretty nuanced, who know the region well, right? Who understands the importance that U.S. leadership or regaining U.S. footing in this part of the world is not through coercion, whether that's economic coercion or military coercion, but it's through leading by example. And so if this review of supply chains is going to lead toward greater innovation that brings these allies and supporters on board, right, working with Korea, with Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, which is a key hub for semiconductor industry, technology and innovation as well. There are large pockets of Southeast Asian economies that can sort of jump on this bandwagon and be supportive in the process of the US review of these supply chains and to identify new partners in Southeast Asia. This comes in neatly with the 2019 to 2025 roadmap that ASEAN has laid out for itself in terms of a digital integration framework, where the focus on data and privacy, on electronic payments, on digital enhanced trade, on digital integration. This is going to be something that's quite exciting. And so the US is serious about leading by example and working with allies, right? This is sort of one area in which the review of US policy can better tap on these sort of diplomatic capital with the region to see how we can better identify ways to collaborate. We shouldn't forget that, I think there is a sort of, if you're comfortable in the position as the US, as the United States is, and you're the global hegemon for almost 8 decades, right? Anybody who's sort of, as you look across your shoulder and there's somebody nipping at your heels, this is going to be a source of concern, right? But for most economies in Southeast Asia, right? I mean, the longstanding narrative is that we don't like to choose, we don't want to choose, and we would like to carry out business as usual, whether or not that's with the Chinese or the Americans or Europeans. And so I think there's a sort of sense that as China's development and growth continue, this is a key impending sort of threat, creating potential power transition vis-a-vis the United States. But this is a US narrative, right? For most in Southeast Asia, China's rise is not an overnight phenomenon. This is something that's been going on for 3 decades. And we've been watching China's growth for a long time to come. And we know, right, if you look at China's rise from the region, from within the region, it's a very painful transition. The uneven recovery that's happening is going to be a long, long way to go for them, right? Tomorrow, they're highlighting and probably unveiling the 14th five-year plan in China with the convening of the National People's Congress. And front and center, right, of that announcement is going to be a rollout of a policy that's going to be more focused on science and technology and innovation at home, promoting a more even and qualitatively balanced growth within China. The dual circulation policy and plan that was announced last September by Xi Jinping is going to kick into full gear with a lot more details about how to spur domestic consumption and how to grow sort of the indigenous technologies, the BYDs that you see in China. How do we promote these kinds of homegrown industries so that they can better serve Chinese interests? And again, there is some silver lining there as well, right? As China begins to focus on the dual circulation policy, it doesn't mean a complete cutoff with the West, let alone with Southeast Asia. There is actually a tremendous amount of opportunity, sort of building on the momentum of the signing and completion of RCEP, right? China and regional economies, there are many convergence points with regard to technology and innovation and research and development. That is going to mean that Southeast Asia again and South Asia are going to be natural partners in this process as China reorients its economy from an export-driven to one that's more balanced and domestic-driven growth. And really fundamental to this, why I'm cautiously optimistic, is that again the Chinese Communist Party, they're pragmatists, right? At stake here is the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party's founding this year, right? So this is part of the 2 centenaries and part of the promise to deliver on the performance legitimacy of the CCP to its domestic constituents is being able to make sure that Chinese economy continues to hum at 5 to 7%. And this means that the Chinese leaders are going to have to be pragmatic in its approach and not sort of going up against the United States too strongly, finding new partners and allies in the process of its reorientation of its economy. And so I think actually there, again, Southeast Asian countries stand to gain if it can also capitalize on China finding a way to diversify its partnership. And so maybe the decoupling isn't necessarily all doom and gloom, right? But this sort of, as Professor Liang said, there are prospects and alternative avenues of recoupling or new diversified partnerships that can come out of this sort of re-examination internally, both in the US policy and the Chinese policy. And so for Southeast Asian economies, I think there's a lot to gain, right? If we think about the old dictum of sort of leaning to one side, right? Southeast Asian economies, right, can lean to both sides in this sort of finding a path out of this sort of rivalry and the sort of decoupling world. The one thing that I would say, and we can talk about this more, the last thing is as the US administration puts front and center climate governance and climate change as well, I mean, this is one in which the tech innovation R&D is you have to bring these key stakeholders back together again, and working with China is going to be front and center of that partnership. And so, can the US really afford to decouple and to separate national security interests from its commercial and business interests and fulfilling Biden's policy agenda? I think that's going to be very tricky. So I actually think that there is some silver lining coming out of this, but it just requires sort of cooler heads to prevail after the NPC is done, after 100 days of Biden administration in place. I think when the first US-China summit kicks in later on this spring, potentially, we can see that some clear areas of convergence is going to come back to a more pragmatic agenda. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Huang, for sort of wrapping up the slate of presentation and also sounding a rather optimistic note on what we could expect, coming out in store for us. I mean, hopefully the summit is going to take place, and from there we could actually see a little bit more clarity in terms of the perspectives from both Beijing and Washington. And I think most of the attention will be on how the so-called co-opetition could take place. I mean, it is, I think, a sort of foregone conclusion that both competition and cooperation, and with a rather heavy emphasis on the former, is going to characterize Sino-US relations going forward. Now, so we have around half an hour for the Q&A, and I managed to sort of put together the various questions. And I thought it's very encouraging to see the questions roll in throughout the past 1 hour. So I tried to summarize them, and I categorize them in 3 blocks, basically, as the first round of the Q&A, right? So the first theme that I thought was interesting has a lot to do with the discussion in the US on the class divide, and of course the attendant domestic issues that had in the first place, sort of brought about the rise of the Trump administration back in 2016, right? And of course these phenomenon continue, under the current administration. And I thought that was interesting, sort of questions that were being asked in relation to that. So in order to have a sort of effective co-opetition, I mean, to take these terms out from the existing literature, is, do you think this is a question that is not just specifically applicable to just Professor Liang, it is applicable for everyone in the panel, is there any effort in this respect to try to overcome the class divide in the US in order to allow it to facilitate a more effective, a more sustainable long-term co-opetition with China? I mean, taking into account a much heightened sense of economic vulnerability, and also after the Capitol Hill insurrection just 2 months ago, there is a sort of loss of credibility. I mean, the discussion and the debate about whether the US has lost its position as the beacon for democracy worldwide. So how does this class divide affect the texture of the future of Sino-US cooperation and competition going forward. So that is the first block of questions that I thought was interesting to address from the panel. And the second block concerns value system. And I think it is very realistic to ask this question because I believe both China and the US are not going to concede or roll back on their existing value system. And in a way, we are seeing here some form of competition, right? Even though Beijing has stated very explicitly that it's not trying to promote its model, but if you look at the narrative that is being put forth by the state media, it has always carried the theme could be better than the Western way of doing things. So with these persistent difference in values, is it possible to engage in healthy competition between both China and the US? Okay, and the last block of questions I thought was interesting relates to the broader ramifications that I will invite the panelists if you want to touch on it head on is possible. I thought just now, Professor Huang, you had mentioned quite a bit on Southeast Asia, and certainly this is one question that emerged in the course of the discussion just now, and broadly is to ask what are the sentiments of allies and partners at large towards the idea of decoupling, and in relation to that, how can the Biden administration get the buy-in on some of the policies towards China from especially allies and partners in Europe in particular, and what is the implication of decoupling to ASEAN member states? Will we be forced to take a firm alignment in that regard? And finally, so how much this decoupling has taken place? And I thought it was interesting is to look at it from a commercial, sort of a private sector perspective. What is the amount of support for that? I thought just now, Professor Liang, you had provided some very interesting statistics that highlighted how the American Chamber of Commerce view these rivalry between China and the US, and the sentiments of the American business community towards them. So I thought it is possible to expand a little bit further. So with that, for this first round of questions and answer, we will go by the order just now of the presenters. So I will invite first Professor Liang to address these questions. Thank you.
Okay, so for your first question about class divide and how you right now create this bipartisan sort of support for a hardline approach towards China, I think it is very important to address that within the United States to foster a more friendly international engagements with China and with maybe globalization at large. I think the economic wounds are real. The middle class felt them being left out from this sort of globalization, and that created I think, poisonous sort of atmosphere, right? That the working class are pitting against each other across border. The American workers would blame Chinese worker, right, for stealing the jobs. But I think really a rising volume of literature has showed, right, that a lot of these middle class economic wounds are caused by the trend or process of franchisation. It is the change in the way businesses do things in the United States, that on the one hand, we have rising capital market, we have rising financial interests, we have financial gains on the one hand, but at the same time, we have the downsize and distribute model that, cut employment, reduce job security, and, reduce incomes and welfare and etc. So I do think that, by reinvesting in its industry and its people, which is what Biden administration vouches to do, I think that will help to reduce some of these economic wounds and would help to pacify these kinds of very oppositional sentiment against China or against globalization per se. So I do think that there is an internal, problem within the United States that needs to be addressed. And I think Biden clearly understands it. That's why he talked about investment. He talked about, injustice. That's your question, number one. And number two, about the values. I think it is clear that, Biden's approach is to align with the democracies. And, I think the recent buzzwords is the between techno democracy versus techno authoritarianism. But I think there were two important points here. One is, I think one of the questions about the coexistence despite the value differences. Well, guess what, right? This has been the case for the past, 40, 50 years, right? I hear that Washington starts to get impatient with Beijing, but let's be fair, right? China has 40 years to build a market institution, to open the market, to change the IP protection system, you name it, right? The US has a century in history, right? We know that 1781, the US is, stealing from other countries in order to industrialize. It's not until, 1891 that the United States passed the patent protection, really. So I think we need to be fair to, how much China has accomplished and how much it has to go. It has still room to improve, for sure, right? But in terms of, just saying that China is gaming the system and, sort of condemn its whole value system, I think that is probably a sort of serve certain purposes. And then when it comes to, really dividing the world into this sort of two camps, I wonder, how desirable is that? Because we do know that a lot of the global challenges require, the democratic countries and authoritarian countries to work together. So I'm just not sure how feasible and desirable that kind of value division is going to serve. On your third question about creating this buy-in from airlines, I think that kind of go back to my second point, which is, to what extent this kinds of value division is helpful. And not to mention, I think, with the capital reservation and with, the changes in the political cycle in the United States, I think many countries have this healthy skepticism as to how much the US is going to stick to, its democratic value, its liberal value. And I think, Professor Huang mentioned this recent sort of exposure of, the Khashoggi case. And it will be interesting to see the United States stand on this, right? And I mean, I don't want to go into that whataboutism that, what about if the US is not doing this, then should China respect human rights and democratic values? I don't think we should go there. But I think the point here is that, to what extent that any countries can simply, exclude or oppose other countries by somehow paying lip services, right, to some of the principles it arguably not necessarily follow. Finally, on your question about, where decoupling is taking place. And I agree with both, Naomi and also Professor Huang, that I do think that decoupling seems to really manifested in technology. And I do think that I echo some of the discussions earlier that the United States could have what some people would call the limited disentanglement in some of the supply chain, in some of the strategic industries. But again, I think the actual picture is much more complicated. I think, there is this big revelation that all of a sudden, we should not rely on China to provide the PPEs or whatnot. But the US government started to look into their stockpile shortage back in 2005 when it comes to ventilation. It just never able to, go around and stockpile that strategic supplies of, necessary equipment. It's not necessarily the fault of China. The US has a competitive advantage in producing ventilation. It didn't do that. And I want easy to say if we would be able to bring back a supply chain, then everything would resolve itself. But I think that is overly stated. I will just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Naomi, your turn. Thank you.
Great, thank you. This is certainly a diverse set of questions, so I'll take them one by one. So improvement of class relations in the U.S. And U.S.-China relations. I do not think that there is a relationship there. In election cycles, the general populace doesn't really care about China. China bashing is really popular among politicians. But to the average person, they're just like, I have mixed feelings about China. But what I really care about is, are you going to cut my taxes? So I don't think that that's a major barometer for the US-China relations. And, you know, US-class relations have been complex and difficult since, you know, America was founded. So I don't see that going, you know, away anytime soon. I think it's also important to note that, you know, farmers in the Rust Belt of America were some of the most vocal in opposition to the tariffs and the trade war with China. So there's a lot of awareness that China is a huge market, regardless of which sector you're in. On the values question and, you know, whether or not we can coexist, I will say that, you know, Americans have a tendency to be very impatient, and some of it is merited when it comes to China and, you know, unfulfilled commitments. Some of it is a lack of cultural understanding, and, you know, in typical negotiation fashion, each side interprets what they commit to in their own way and to their own liking. But I think overall, the US needs to understand that China's not a monolith. It's not going to be pushed to move any faster than it's already going. And it's a different system, a different approach. And we have to be realistic in what we can shift. But just because the system is different and the perspectives are a little bit different doesn't mean that it's completely incompatible, that there aren't areas for cooperation. On getting ally buy-in to President Biden's, you know, potential for decoupling, as I said in my remarks, I think that it's an uphill battle, and will be difficult for a number of reasons. But I think paramount among them will be economic recovery in the aftermath of COVID. In terms of implications for ASEAN states, I would look more to my colleagues for their comments on that. But I appreciated Professor Huang's comments in his remarks that, you know, in the Asia Pacific, you know, countries don't like to have to choose. And I think that's also important for the United States to keep in mind as they look at potential allies and across techno-democracies. And you know, to keep in mind, you don't want to push countries in one direction or the other necessarily if they don't have to make that choice in order for the economic wins to still be in your interest. How much decoupling has actually taken place? A lot. So in just the US-China context, there has been a lot of churn. And it started with tariffs. I think as soon as companies realized that tariffs were just the tip of the iceberg, there was going to be a cascade of follow-on policies, you know, in export controls and supply chain executive orders, and the errant tweet criticizing companies for, you know, bowing to the Chinese government and not coming back to the U.S., even if they were never really fully there. You know, as soon as that started to become apparent, companies decided, look, this is not a short-term thing that we just have to weather. We need to make decisions about where to reorient supply chains. Some of this, you know, as we talked about in the context of COVID, identifying those single points of failure was an exercise that a lot of companies had to go through. And, you know, businesses do try to continually assess, where are those single points of failure? Where do we need to diversify our supply chains? Where are we too reliant on China? And that absolutely was a calculus that had to happen. I think companies would have preferred that it had been less of a, you know, taking hammer to nail type of contemplation of supply chains, and they had a little bit more time to adapt. But yeah, ultimately decoupling has happened, and we're not going back to the same pre-Trump era in terms of supply chains. There will be a continued need to at least diversify supply chains, if not fully decouple. And as I pointed out, you can see in the Chamber of Commerce report, the metrics, the numbers are there in terms of what the impact of that decoupling has been.
Thank you. Professor Huang, over to you.
Sure, thank you. So on the first question on class divide, the foreign policy implication for that, I think, is I think it's going to be pretty clear that any hopes of the Biden administration regaining regional footing by joining or rejoining TPP 2.0, some version of that, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Deal, is probably not going to happen. And that may be a disappointment for some, but it's a reflection of the growing sense of economic nationalism that is in the United States. And if you think about how Biden won, the key states in Michigan and Pennsylvania, these were the people who had voted for Trump in 2016 and have been a little bit disillusioned with the notion that Make America Great Again did not actually pan out for those who have lost their jobs. And the narrative, again, is pitting this all to China, that they're stealing our jobs, that production has shifted there. And so we're going to negotiate, we're going to be tough on China. That hasn't panned out. So I think Biden is probably pretty mindful that, you know, this wave that he cashed in on to try and reorient the focus on the United States, the class divide, the uneven growth that's been happening, the disparity between the rich and the poor across states in the United States. I think that's something that he needs to be very, very mindful of, and it's going to be front and center of his domestic agenda. And so to turn around and then say that the United States is back in the game and joining TPP, the new version is going to be there, is just unrealistic. It would be something that most of his voters would probably not be convinced that he was serious with his pledge to put American workers' interests first. So I think, you know, that means that the United States would probably have to look for other areas to sort of engage with this part of the world. You know, the digital trade and other sectors are probably going to be much more important. Again, it'll be sort of sectoral issues where we see U.S. re-engagement with this part of the world. You can expect with the key technological powerhouses in Northeast Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. U.S. Taiwan has just had a pretty senior level dialogue on the technology front, discussing semiconductor production with companies like TSMC, with Taiwan's economic counterpart, to make sure that the supply is there. So I think we are beginning to see some signs of this sort of indication of working with like-minded partners in the region. And again, with Southeast Asia, if the supply sort of chain review is about, you know, reconfiguring growth and U.S. growth and reorienting its supply chains to new sources, you know, places like India, places in Southeast Asia where production costs are cheaper, where research and development is growing, with a lot of these countries that are investing in sort of digital economies. Again, the ASEAN Digital Innovation Integration Framework, I think that presents a pretty exciting opportunity, actually, where the United States can sort of insert itself as a credible partner to provide the kind of financial, technological, and human capital support to countries in Southeast Asia to get their buy-in, but also to expand their production, their supply chain, and diversify beyond China. On the value system question, is it irreconcilable? Is it a healthy competition? It's probably more of a healthy competition. I think, you know, as the Chinese leadership looks to developing its country into a moderately well-off society, economy, this year, and then in the 2030s becoming a sort of high-income country. That's the goal the CCP has set for itself. It means that this is not going to be done through domestic consumption alone, right? The Chinese leaders are smart enough to think that this cannot be achieved. As big and expansive its domestic market is, it still requires, right, the Chinese to be closely integrated with regional economies and with the United States. So I think there are these sort of convergence points in which there are interests on the Chinese side, and as Naomi put it, when negotiations happen, they're going to find these convergence points, and they're going to try to identify ways in which these overlapping interests are going to be the main focus. What can the United States provide to China to sustain this continued economic growth, right, that produces a great degree of stability in the Asia-Pacific region? And then what can the Chinese do for the Americans to make sure that the optics of China stealing the jobs of American workers are going to be reduced, that the Chinese are actually living up to its commitments they signed up for 2 decades ago with regard to international rules of the game in terms of trade, intellectual property protection, and things of that nature. So there's going to be a natural convergence point. And I'm actually convinced that there are people in this administration who are smart and savvy enough to know and understand that this is not a zero-sum kind of game, and that in spite of the decoupling that's already beginning to happen, we want to try to slow down and kind of reset the button and try to get U.S.-China relations on a more constructive path. So I'll end there.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Huang. In interest of time, because we are now down to just 2 minutes, and understand that some of you may have something that go on that you have to attend to. So allow me to perhaps do the brief closing for this. I believe we have touched on a good number of issue areas. I mean, one that is very pertinently couched in terms of how do we reconcile values and how do we engage in pragmatic cooperation and competition going forward. And this idea of decoupling is certainly, and something that's going to continue to come back to us in the course of the next 4 years. So, allow me to thank all of you, with special thanks to Professor Liang, Naomi, Professor Huang, for taking time off your busy schedules to join us. On behalf of RSIS, thank you so much. And we look forward to engage you more intensely in the future, right? So with that, I will call this webinar to a close, and we will see you all again next time in our future events. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.